Good morning, everyone. My name is Chetan Singh Gill, and I welcome you to today's webinar. Today's webinar is being organized by Chandigarh Judicial Academy in collaboration with SEC Online. Today's webinar is on the Specific Relief Act, and in today's session we'll be covering the section up to 25. And today's session will be taken by Baljinder Singh Sarasar, who's an ADJ cum faculty member in Chandigarh Judicial Academy. We have heard him before as well. This is not the first time he's doing this webinar. And we already know that when it comes to sharing knowledge, he takes full interest and he devotes his full time. I think without a further ado, I will just request Baljinder Singh Sarasar to please start the session. And one thing that I want to also bring it to everyone notice that please raise your questions after the session is over, because most of the questions would already be addressed by Sarasar's detailing. And if you still have questions, you can ask the question in the question answer round. Sarasar, I request you please to take the platform and start the session, sir.
Thank you, Chetan. First of all, I thank the Academy as well as SEC Online for giving me this opportunity to interact with my worthy colleagues. Today's topic is Specific Relief Act. I shall be taking up to section 25 of the Act, and the remaining sections would be taken by my worthy colleague Mr. Gopal Arora tomorrow. Now, so far as Specific Relief Act is concerned, it is one of the important Act whose application we find day in, day out in our routine working. In almost all the suits which the trial court entertains, as well as the first appeals being entertained by the first appellate court, the application of this act comes handy. Now, if we examine the structure of this act, there are total 8 kinds of reliefs which are dealt with in the act. Now, these reliefs, which are of specific nature, are not exhaustive. Even if the relief is not covered within the ambit of Specific Relief Act, still the suit would be maintainable under section 9 CPC. Even in respect of the reliefs which are stated in the Act, it is not exhaustive. So therefore, even if the case of the plaintiff is not covered within the 4 corners of a particular relief, still in certain situation, the relief is available and maintainable to the plaintiff. For instance, relief of declaration. So even if the plaintiff case is not covered within the 4 corners of section 34, still he can seek declaration under the general law. Now, there are total 8 kinds of reliefs. I shall be dealing with the first 3 reliefs under the Act, that is recovery of property, movable as well as immovable, and specific performance of contract. The relief of rectification, rescission, cancellation, declaration, and injunctions shall be dealt with by my worthy colleague. Now, the first important provision which I would like to share with all of you is section 4. Section 4 states that specific relief is maintainable only for enforcing individual civil rights and not for enforcing penal laws. But this section is not a hindrance in adjudicating civil reliefs where one of the issues may be of a criminal nature. We can take 2 examples to explain this. In a civil suit based on the wrongful death of a person claiming damages one of the issue or core issue which needs adjudication is whether the defendant caused the death of some person on whose behalf the plaintiffs are claiming damages. Another instance is inheritance of a person murdered by the murderer, which entails the application of Section 25 of the Hindu Succession Act, which disables a murderer or anybody claiming through him the property or inheritance of the person murdered. In all these civil suits, one of the key issues which would require adjudication is regarding the wrongful death having been caused by a person. Now, so far as Section 25 of Hindu Succession Act is concerned, the word murder employed therein has been used in the generic sense. It has not been used in the technical sense in which it is employed under the IPC. That is one. Second, the adjudication or decision or judgment of the criminal court is not as such binding or relevant in the civil suit. So therefore, even if a person has been acquitted on the benefit of doubt in the criminal case, even then on the civil side, his liability can be fixed irrespective of the result of the adjudication on the criminal side, and the plaintiff can be awarded damages against the defendant for causing wrongful death, or a person may be disabled to inherit the property of the person whom he has murdered. Here, I would like to draw the attention of my colleagues to Section 40 to 44 of the Indian Evidence Act, which would be relevant while adjudicating such kind of suits. It will indicate as to how far the judgments of the criminal courts would be relevant in adjudicating the civil cases and vice versa. Then, before undertaking the first relief, let us quickly have a look on the Specific Relief Amendment Act 2018, which has made substantial changes to the structure of the Act. Now, this Amendment Act came into force on 1st of October 2018. The first question which rankles our mind is whether this Amendment Act is prospective or retrospective in nature. Now, as of now, we have two judgments of two different high courts which have dealt with this issue. One is of Calcutta High Court and second is of Allahabad High Court. In both the judgments, it has been held that the Amendment Act of 2018 is retrospective in nature. A question also arose before the Learned Apex Court recently in Sushil Kumar Agarwal case, but it was not decided. The Apex Court observed in para 28 that this issue is not relevant for the decision of the case, and therefore we could not have any decision of the Apex Court on the point whether these amendments are prospective or retrospective in nature. But so far as the other two high courts are concerned, they have dealt with the issue, especially the Allahabad High Court, in detail and came to the conclusion that the amendments are retrospective in its nature. Otherwise, also Specific Relief Act is an adjective act, adjective law, procedural law. A similar issue also arose when the transition was made from the Act of 1877 to the Act of 1963. Then also the courts held that the Act of 63 is retrospective in its nature. Then let us have a quick look on the features of this Amendment Act. The ambit of Section 6 has been considerably widened, or we can say clarified. Section 10, which deals with specific performance of a contract, there has been a paradigm shift, and now grant of specific performance has been made a rule subject to the provisions of sections 11(2), 14 and 16. Then 14 has been restructured, which enlists the categories of contracts which cannot be specifically enforced. 14A enables the court to engage the experts and seek their opinion while adjudicating matters under the Act. 15 and 19 has been partially modified. Addition has been made in respect of limited liability partnership. Section 16 has been again slightly modified, and the requirement of averment as regard the readiness and willingness to perform the contract, it has been relaxed. Then Section 20 has been substituted, and now an additional remedy has been provided of substituted performance of contract, which was earlier not available. We shall be taking up this remedy in detail also. Then 20A relates to infrastructural projects and bars the court from granting injunction in such cases where it would impede or delay the progress or completion of such projects. Then the Act contemplates the setting up of special courts to speedily decide cases under the Act relating to infrastructural projects. Now, the special courts are only for deciding such cases, that is, contracts relating to infrastructural projects. But so far as speedy trial is concerned, it is applicable to all categories of cases under the Act. And the timeline specified is 12 months from the date of service of summons to the defendant, and it is extendable up to 6 months after recording reasons. So therefore, we have a total timeline of 18 months for adjudication of the suits under this Act. Then 20 has been slightly amended, and the word in substitution has been deleted. Then 25 has been nominally touched. Merely the name of the Act has been changed. Then 41 has again been amended, and clause HA has been added, directing the non-grant of injunction in respect of infrastructural projects if it would impede or delay the progress of such projects. Now I shall be first taking the relief of specific performance of a contract. That is the most common category of suit which the courts deal with. Now, so far as the specific performance of a contract is concerned, whenever a contract has been entered into or executed between the parties, it is expected that it would be honored by the parties on their own. The facility of the court is required by the party or parties only when the promise made under the contract is not honored by one of the party. So in normal cases, the parties honor their promises on their own, and they do not require the facility of the court for enforcing the contracts. It is only on the breach of a contract that the parties require the facility of the court to adjudicate their respective rights. On a breach of a contract, after the amendment of 2018, a party now has 3 distinct remedies. Earlier, a party had 2 remedies. Now it has 3 remedies. First is to seek specific performance of a contract, which also include injunction. because it is also one of the means to specifically enforce a contract. Second is compensation for the damages for the loss incurred by the party on account of the breach. And the third, which has been added by the amendment of 2018, is technically called as right to cover. But under the Act, we call it as substituted performance. Now, this remedy says that on a breach of a contract made by either or any of the party to a contract, the non-defaulting party is required to issue a notice upon the defaulting party to perform the contract. In case, even after receiving the notice, the defaulting party does not perform the contract, then the innocent party can either engage the third party or at its own level perform the contract and later on seek recovery of the expenses and other costs actually incurred, spent or suffered by the party from the party who has defaulted. So once the contract is performed either through the third party or through his own agency, the contract stands performed. Now the only thing left is to recover the expenses, damages and other costs from the defaulting party. Now whenever a case or a suit comes before the court regarding specific performance of a contract, the few principles which must be kept in mind by the court are: the court should be thorough with the Specific Relief Act 1963, principles of equity, and third is contractual principles under the Contract Act. I'll just demonstrate how these principles would be handy in adjudicating these disputes. Now, since we are talking of the relief of specific performance of a contract, let us have a look at the means or modes or ways for a discharge of a contract. A contract can be discharged either by performance, the rules of which are stated in section 31 to 67 of the Indian Contract Act. Second is by supervening impossibility or frustration, which is there in section 56. By agreement, that is novation, substitution, remittance, the rules of which are stated in section 62 to 67 of the Act. And next is by breach, which includes the anticipatory breach of a contract under 39 or a breach on the due date of performance of a contract. Now, next important point or a practical issue which all of us come across while adjudicating these kind of suits, that it has come across that the trial courts, while adjudicating these suits based upon specific performance of a contract, frame very generic issues, which creates a lot of problems before the first appellate court at the time of hearing the first appeal. The reason is that the losing party would always contest that proper issues were never framed. Second, that no separate finding was recorded on the material points or issues which arose in such kind of disputes. Now, generally, we find that while framing issues, the learned trial courts, they'll frame a generic issue whether a party is entitled to the specific performance of a contract or to a possession of property on the basis of specific performance of a contract. So whatever the relief clauses, so that is turned into a primary issue in such kind of disputes. Now this generic issue basically involves a lot many sub issues on which no separate finding most of the time is recorded by the London trial courts, creating a lot of confusion and rather sometime wrong adjudication of the disputes. Now, if we examine the relief of specific performance of a contract, what are the key issues on which the London trial court is required to record the finding? Now, the first important point is formation of a valid contract between the parties. Now, this is the bedrock, this is the fulcrum, or this is the basis on which the suit is instituted. The onus to prove this issue will always be upon the plaintiff. Second is breach of a contract. This again is a ticklish issue which requires adjudication as to which party committed the breach. It may be possible that in a given situation, even though the plaintiff is before the court, but breach is also made by him. It is not the defendant. So there has to be a specific finding as to which of the party is in breach of the contract. Then another issue which requires proper adjudication is whether time is of the essence of the contract. Section 55 of the Indian Contract Act is relevant in this context. Now, while adjudicating these two factors or two issues, it is necessary to go through the terms of the contract very, very carefully. In most of the contracts, there are baby steps which are required to be taken by either of the parties at different stages before the contract reaches fruition or reaches its final stage. So one has to go through the terms and find that if there was a breach of the essential terms by one of the party, then the other party may be relieved from performing his part of the promise. So all these factors should be taken into consideration and a specific finding needs to be recorded. Then another important point or issue is, in most of the contracts, we find a forfeiture clause, forfeiture of the earnest money, or stipulation of damages, that if the seller defaulted, then buyer would be entitled to double the earnest amount, or if the buyer defaulted, then seller would be entitled to forfeit the earnest money. So there has to be a specific finding whether this forfeiture clause or stipulation regarding damages is in the nature of reasonable damages or penalty under the Indian Contract Act. Then next is, even if it is in the nature of a penalty, then we need to know what is the loss which the party has suffered from the broken contract, and accordingly assess the reasonable damages in a given case. Take for instance, in a contract based upon immovable property, to sell immovable property, it is the buyer who had defaulted, and there is a forfeiture clause of earnest money in the contract. Now question is, suppose we reach a finding that it is the buyer who committed the breach of the contract. Now the question comes, what is the loss which is suffered by the seller? Whether the forfeiture clause in this contract is a penalty or is in the shape of a reasonable damages? If it is a penalty, what are the reasonable damages which we should award to the seller in this case? So there should be clear-cut finding on all these aspects before we adjudicate any suit based upon specific performance of a contract. The next important point which I would like to discuss or share with you is regarding the time being of the essence of the contract. We are of the general impression that in respect of contract to sell immovable properties, time is not of the essence of the contract. This is a general line or which we most of the time find in the judgments of the learned trial courts. But let us understand what this entire concept is. Now, in order to find out whether the time of performance of the promises fixed in the contract is of the essence of the contract or not, the test laid down by the court is intention of the parties. Now, it is a mixed question of fact and law or a question of fact. This intention can be ascertained from either the express words used in the contract or the nature of the property which forms the subject matter of the contract, the nature of the contract itself, the surrounding circumstances. So these are the general guidelines which must be kept in mind while adjudicating on this point in such suits. Then we must be thorough regarding the rules given in the Indian Contract Act regarding the time and place of performance where the contract is silent, the order of performance of reciprocal promises, which is there in section 51 to 54. Then let us see what are the factors which makes time essence of the contract. So one is where the parties have expressly agreed to treat it as the essence of the contract, it will indicate their intention that time fixed in the contract to perform it is required to be adhered to, and in no case this time limit can be stepped over. Second is where delay will operate as an injury. And third is where the nature and necessity of the contract require it to be so construed. So therefore there are different other principles, sub-principles in this, but these are the broad three factors which have been laid down by the courts to find out whether time given in the contract is of the essence of the contract or not. We can take few examples. Business and commercial contracts, the time fixed in the contract is taken to be of the essence of the contract generally. In construction contract, again the time is of the essence of the contract. Then sale transaction of movable property, that depends upon each case whether the time fixed is of the essence of the contract or not. For example, A orders a dress for her marriage from some shopkeeper. Now the time of delivery of this movable article, movable property, is of the essence of the contract. So therefore it will be decided on case-to-case basis. Then right of renewal and other privileges, the general principle is the time fixed is of the essence of the contract. For then agreement of reconveyance, again the time fixed therein is of the essence of the contract. For instance, A transfer immovable property to B by way of a sale deed, and there is also an agreement of reconveyance between the parties which the buyer can avail of within 1 year of the sale. So if the 1 year elapsed, then he will not be able to seek specific performance of this contract. The next important point is regarding the contracts relating to immovable property. Generally, and invariably, we find that it is recorded in the judgments in respect of such contracts that time is not of the essence of the contract. But this general common law principle has been modified and admits of certain exceptions. So these exceptions must also be taken care of or duly noted while adjudicating such suits. The first exception is this general principle is subject to the intention of the parties, which may be gathered from the terms of the contract or the circumstances of the case. Second is if this contract was of a commercial nature, like where a developer requires property for development purpose and to further sell it, their time given in the contract is of the essence of the contract. Then in case of urban immovable property, time mentioned in the contract to sell immovable property is of the essence of the contract. So therefore, this general principle get displaced in all these three situations. Then we can take examples also of the first situation, where the judicial courts have held that time mentioned in the contract in case of contract to sell immovable property is of the essence of the contract. Property sold for meeting the business needs, repayment of the loan, to meet day-to-day living expenses, to send children abroad, to meet the expenses of marriage, or if somebody wanted to buy another residential property after selling the property. So in all these situations, the time stipulated in the contract is of the essence of the contract. Then buyer purchasing land for commercial transaction for developing the same, this here also it will be of the essence of the contract. Now another important aspect is the case of subsequent purchaser in such contracts. We often come across cases where there is a prior contract to sell immovable property between A and B. Let us suppose A is the seller and B is the buyer. And then A again makes a contract of this with C. So therefore, we have two agreement to sell in respect of the same property. Second situation is where there is a prior agreement to sell and thereafter the seller execute a sale deed in favor of third party. So we have prior agreement to sell and subsequent sale deed in respect of the same immovable property. Then third situation is where there is an agreement to sell and on its breach, a party has filed the suit in the court seeking its specific performance, and pending the suit, the property has been sold to some third party. That is a case of pendente lite transfer. Now, the difficulty or the mistake which occurs while adjudicating such disputes is that the court applies the principle of priority, which is also statutorily incorporated in section 48 of the Transfer of Property Act. Now, in the first situation, where there are two agreements to sell, one is prior in time and second is subsequent in time, the principle of priority will apply, and the first one would be specifically enforced. But mostly we find the second case where there is a prior agreement to sell and subsequent sale deed, which is definitely before the institution of the suit. Now there also the trial court applies the principle of priority, which is incorrect. The principle of priority would not be applicable in this situation. The case is covered by section 40 of the Transfer of Property Act and section 91 of the Indian Trust Act 1882. Now in this situation, we have a prior agreement to sell whose specific performance is being sought by filing a suit, and we have a subsequent sale deed in favor of third party, which is prior to the institution of the suit. So here the principle of priority is not applicable. Principle of priority is applicable only and only when the transactions are of the same nature. Same nature means, like in case of section 48 of the Transfer of Property Act, it deals with completed transfers and not with the agreements and all that. Now the case of this nature is covered by section 40 of the Transfer of Property Act. It incorporates indirectly the principle of equity, justice and conscience. So therefore, even if this section in terms is not applicable to the state of Punjab and Haryana, the underlying principle is still applicable. Section 54 of the Transfer of Property Act, which is applicable to the state of Punjab and Haryana also, clearly says in its ultimate para that a contract to sell immovable property does not transfer any interest in the property to the buyer. So no interest is transferred. It is only a personal contract between the parties which is capable of being enforced. But it is not a charge which get attached to the property, that it can be, that it will go along with the, or it will run along with the land or property. So this case is covered by section 40, second paragraph, which says that the obligation arising out of a contract where a third party is entitled to the benefit of an obligation arising out of a contract and annexed to the ownership of immovable property, but not amounting to any interest. Such right or obligation can be enforced by a transferee with notice or a volunteer transferee, that is gratuitous transferee of property. Now it has often come across while adjudicating such kind of dispute, the trial court seldom invoke section 40 of the Transfer of Property Act, and there is no clear-cut finding whether the agreement to sell, which is even though prior in point of time, whether this requires specific performance or this will give way to the rights of the subsequent transferee. Because if the subsequent transferee did not have any notice of the prior contract, in that case he is not bound by it. Then his sale deed cannot be set aside. Then this specific performance cannot be granted, and only the alternate relief of damages should be granted. But if the subsequent transferee is gratuitous transferee, like in case of gift deed, in that eventuality, irrespective of the notice, the prior contract would be binding upon the subsequent volunteer or gratuitous transferee, and therefore this gift deed can be set aside in that situation. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that this provision should be kept in mind. Its principle should be very much clear in the mind of the trial courts while adjudicating such suits. The illustration appended to the provision is also clear on the same point and is self-evident. Then have section 91 of the Indian Trust Act. It also talks of the same thing. It says where a person acquires property with notice that another person has entered into an existing contract affecting the property of which specific performance could be enforced, the former must hold that property for the benefit of the latter to the extent necessary to give effect to the contract. So these provisions must be kept in mind while adjudicating such suits. The principle of priority would not be attracted in this very situation. The next is the case of pendentality transferee. Now this one is quite simple. Here, if there is a pendentality transfer, this will be subject to the outcome of the litigation or the suit. Now, let us have an overview of the provisions relating to specific performance of contract after its amendment by the Amendment Act 2018. And let us see how it will change the way we adjudicate such suits or disputes before us. Now, if we compare section 10 after amendment and before amendment, we will notice two paradigm shifts. One is that earlier it was a discretionary relief, but now it says that it shall be enforced by the court. Second, earlier there were two additional elements before a party seeks specific performance of a contract. One was that the breach cannot be compensated in terms of money, or even if compensated, it would not be adequate one. So these were the two additional factors or conditions with which this relief was hatched with. Now these conditions have been removed. Earlier we had two rebuttable presumptions of law in respect of contract to transfer immovable property. The presumption was that the above two conditions would not exist, and therefore the onus to prove these conditions were shifted upon the defendant. But in respect of transfer of movable property, the presumption was otherwise, except in few situations. So there also the burden reversed upon the defendant in both those few situations. Otherwise, the burden remained upon the plaintiff to prove that the above two conditions do not exist. But now after the amendment, it simply says once a party has chosen his remedy, because I've already stated that on the breach of the contract, now after the amendment, a party has three distinct remedy and he can choose any of the three remedies. The party is assured by the law that whatever remedy he chooses, that would be enforced. So he can either choose specific performance of the contract, he can choose the remedy of claiming damages only, or he can choose the right to cover, that is by substituted performance, and thereafter recover the expenses from the defaulting party. Second is section 14. Now section 14 has been restructured entirely. It gives a list of contracts which are not specifically enforceable. So if the contract fell or falls under any of these categories, the specific performance will be refused by the court and the alternate relief of damages may be granted by the court. So the first is where the party has obtained the substituted performance of the contract in terms of section 20. So once the contract has been performed by third party or by the party through his own agency, then the question of seeking its specific performance from the other party does not arise. Second is contract which involves the performance of continuous duty which the court can't supervise. Here also specific performance cannot be granted. Third is which are dependent upon personal qualification of the parties, or the court cannot specifically enforce the material terms of the contract. And last is contract which in its nature are determinable. Now, so far as the employment contracts are concerned, now those are definitely personal contracts requiring personal qualification, but they have three exceptions also. One is those employees who are covered within the ambit of Article 311 of the Constitution of India. Second, those who are covered under the Industrial Dispute Act or labor laws. Third, where the employment is under some statutory corporation or rules. So except these three employment contracts, others cannot be specifically enforced by the court. In case of building, repair and development contracts, if we see section 14 earlier, we had exception of building contract which can be specifically enforced on the satisfaction of certain conditions. Now all those have been removed from the ambit of section 14, but despite its removal, the court can still grant specific performance of such contract subject to the same very conditions. Now conditions, if we examine, the work of construction should be described in sufficiently precise manner in order for the court to determine the exact nature of the building or work. The plaintiff must have substantial interest in the performance of the contract. Then defendant has obtained possession of the property, either whole or part of the same, to execute the work. On satisfaction of these three conditions, the court can grant specific performance of these contract. This has been a matter of issue in a recent case also, where the court laid down the same very conditions. Then next important part is section 16, that is personal bars to relief. Now this has been slightly modified. The idea to restructure this provision was to assure the person who has suffered the broken contract that if he chooses the remedy of specific performance, he will get it. And the technical glitches which earlier used to operate to defeat this remedy, they are no longer there. Now in clause C, the word averment has been removed. Now the only thing is that the obligation cost is that who fails to prove that he has performed and has always been ready and willing to perform the essential terms of the contract. Now this clause has got three components. One is that there should be readiness and willingness. Readiness deals with the capacity of the party to perform his part of the promise under the contract. The term willingness indicates the intention of the parties to perform his part of the contract, irrespective of the fact whether he has the capacity to do so or not. And third is the distinction being carved out between the essential terms of the contract and non-essential terms of the contract. And the procedural part is failure to prove the same. But this change in the nomenclature will have slight bearing practically when we deal with this part. The reason for this is that the general rule of pleadings shall govern the employment of this clause. Now, earlier there was a statutory requirement of pleading and proof of these conditions. Now the statutory requirement is only regarding proof. So far as pleading is concerned, that has been relegated to the general law of pleadings. The general principle is the evidence cannot travel beyond the pleadings. So unless a fact has been pleaded, no evidence can be led on the same. Therefore, even after the amendment, the pleading of this averment is necessary, but its rigor has been modified and substantially reduced. Now, after the amendment, after this relaxation, it would be like this, that the averment in the plaint regarding this fact is no longer the statutory requirement. The court would be liberal in allowing the introduction of this plea at any stage of the suit. And this plea can also be introduced even if the period of limitation to file a fresh suit of specific performance has expired. Now, earlier in most of the cases, the courts used to disallow the introduction of this averment if it was being introduced after the expiry of period of limitation. So now the rigor has been quite reduced. Regarding amendment of pleading, we have Order 6, Rule 17 CPC, where again after the post amendment of 2002, we have pre-trial and post-trial amendment, and element of due diligence has been added in the post amendment application. Now this has also been held by the Apex Court in this case of 2019, that pleading is required, though it can be introduced at any stage. Then next is substituted performance of contract. I've already explained the remedy. So the conditions are that a mandatory 30 days notice is required to be given by the promisee to the promisor for rectifying the breach. If the promisor fails to rectify, then the promisee may proceed to obtain substitute performance. After he has got the contract performed, either through third party or through his own agency, then he can obtain or recover expenses of the same from the promisor. And this remedy would place the promisee in the same position he would be had the promisor perform the promise. Then 20A only says that injunction in these projects will not be granted if it impedes or delays their progress. 14A deals with the expert assistance. 21 I've already stated. Then I would just briefly touch the other two remedies, that is recovery of possession of property, recovery of specific immovable property and movable property. Now, if we examine section 5 and 6 of the Act, then there can be three kinds of suits to recover the possession. Rather, we can say four. One is the suit based upon proprietary title. That one who is the legal owner of the property, he can file the suit and recover its possession on the principle that possession follows the ownership. The second category of suit is suit based upon possessory title. Now, so far as possessory title is concerned, this title is good against the whole world except the true owner. Both these category of suits are covered by section 5 of the Act, and under the CPC, the suits can be filed and possession can be recovered. The third category is the suit based upon prior possession, which is covered by Section 6 of the Act. And now, even where a party has perfected his title by adverse possession, this prescriptive title, if a person is dispossessed after the lapse of the time period, then in that case, this person can also file a suit and claim back his possession. So now we have 4 categories of suits. 3 are covered by Section 5 and 1 is covered by Section 6 of the Act. Now, insofar as Section 6 is concerned, we need to understand the meaning of settled possession, because Section 6 protect juridical possession of the parties. Now, what is juridical possession? It means a possession which is protected by law. So a possession of a trespasser also, if it becomes settled, enters the arena of juridical possession. Now, what are the attributes of settled possession? First is the trespasser must be in actual physical possession of the property over a sufficiently long period. Now, what would be a sufficiently long period would depend upon the facts and circumstances of each case. Second attribute is that the possession must be to the knowledge, either express or implied, of the owner. So there should not be any concealment by the trespasser. Third is the process of dispossession by the trespasser must be complete and final and must be acquiesced to by the owner. A trespasser who is in the process of dispossession of the true owner can be forcibly evicted by the true owner by exercising reasonable force, and even if he causes some injuries to the trespasser, the same do not amount to any offence under the right of private defence under the provisions of Indian Penal Code. So while the trespasser is in the act of trespassing, he can be forcibly removed from there or resisted. Now, in case of cultivable or cultivable land, the test laid down is to find out whether the possession of the trespasser has become settled or not, is that if he has grown the crops, in that case, the true owner must take recourse to legal remedy to obtain the possession. Then in a recent case also, the Apex Court said that settled possession must be effective, undisturbed, to the knowledge of the owner without any attempt at concealment. And there is no straitjacket formula to determine it. Occupation of the property by a person as an agent, servant, they at the instance of the owner will not amount to actual legal possession, therefore they cannot take the aid of the court in protecting their possession against the owner. The possession should contain an element of animus possidendi also. Now, what is an immovable property? It is defined under the General Clauses Act. It will include both tangible, intangible, corporeal, incorporeal rights. Under Section 5, the relief of recovery of possession is a matter of right and is not a discretion with the court. Entitled to possession means that a person has either the possessory or proprietary title or prescriptive title now. Manner provided by CPC means a regular suit is required to be filed. Then the next important part in this regard is the period of limitation. For this, we have Article 64 and 65 of the Limitation Act. Article 64 relates to suit based upon possessory title, and the limitation period is 12 years for filing the suit. But the terminus echo for this limitation period is the date of dispossession. In 65, which relates to suit based upon ownership rights or ownership title, the period again is 12 years, but terminus echo is the date when the possession of the defendant becomes adverse to the plaintiff. So therefore, a suit based upon legal title or legal ownership does not have any such period of limitation. The onus shall be upon the other party who is claiming adverse possession to prove as to when this 12-year period commenced and when it terminated. Now, as per Article 111 and 222 of the Limitation Act, in respect of government or public authority, the time period for ripening of adverse possession into prescriptive title is 30 years. In private properties or other cases, it is 12 years. The next important point is that whether a plea of jus tertiae, that is third party rights, can be taken in a suit under Section 5 even when it is based upon possessory title. The answer is no. Even if the ownership vests with some third party, then also the defendant cannot defeat the right of the person who is in prior possession of the property to claim back the possession under Section 5 of the Act. Obviously, this suit would not be maintainable against the true owner. The next important part is person in adverse possession. Now I'll quickly deal with only 2 points on this. That can a person in adverse possession file suit for declaration and permanent injunction? Answer is yes, he can. Can there be a taking of time period of 12 years or 30 years, as the case may be, in respect of adverse possession? Answer is yes. Now, so far as the concept of taking is concerned, it means addition of the time period in adverse possession of 2 different persons. This is available in some situation, like where A is in adverse possession for a period of 6 years. He dies and this possession is inherited by his son C, who also remain in possession for 6 years. So he can add 6 years of his father and his own 6 years to complete the period of 12 years for acquiring prescriptive title to the property. Similarly, there can be a case of transfer also. There also this time period can be tagged. Then I'll only explain a few part in this Section 6, that which are the parties who can approach the court to recover possession under Section 6. So first one is a person who is actually dispossessed. He can definitely approach the court and seek repossession under Section 6. A person through whom he has been in possession. For instance, a tenant is in possession through his landlord. So in the eventuality of tenant being dispossessed, both landlord or tenant can file the suit under 6 and claim the possession. And where the landlord is filing the suit under Section 6, tenant would not be a necessary party in that situation. Third is any person claiming through him. Suppose the tenant sublet the premises which he was entitled to under the lease deed or rent deed. In that case, all three, landlord, tenant, subtenant, they can approach the court and seek recovery of possession. Then let us see who are the parties who can avail these remedies. Trespasser in settled possession, yes, he can approach under section 6. Licensee, if he is dispossessed by a third party, then during the currency of the license, he can definitely come under section 6 and claim back the possession from this third party. But if the period of license is over or he is dispossessed by the licensor, then he cannot avail the remedy under section 6. Then servant or agent, they cannot come and avail the remedy under section 6. They can only file the suit on behalf of their master or principal. Then previous trespasser in settled possession can definitely sue the subsequent trespasser. Now tenant. Now in case of tenant, there can be three situations. One is during the currency of the tenancy period, a tenant has a legal right to remain in possession. So therefore, if he is dispossessed by any party, including the landlord, he can approach under section 6. Now suppose the period of tenancy is over. That is in case of tenant holding over. There again he can claim the remedy under section 6 if he is dispossessed either by the third party or by the owner. But where the tenancy period is still remaining, then he can approach under 5 and 6 both. But if the period is over, then the only remedy is under section 6. Then we have section 7 and 8, which deals with recovery of movable property. We can quickly just see the difference part only because the time probably is already over. Section 7 represents the common law rule to recover movable property. Section 8 is based upon equitable rule. Section 7 is
Sir, you keep on talking. I'll call Aman. No worries, sir.
Yes,
I'll talk to Aman.
The rule under section 7 is independent of the nature of property and the relationship between the parties. A person having even temporary right can claim the relief under section 6. But section 8 relates to special rule and is dependent upon the nature of the property or the relationship of the parties. Section 7 suit can be brought against the owner of the property, but under section 8, suit cannot be filed against the owner of the property. So far as the procedural part is concerned, a decree under section 7 is governed by Order 20 Rule 10 CPC, and the plaintiff has to state the estimated value of the movable property in the alternate, whereas a suit under section 8 to recover the article in specie is available only in the 4 situations, and this fact has to be specifically stated by the plaintiff. Mr. Chetan?
Yes, sir.
Now probably entertain the question answer session.
Sure, sir. First of all, I asked Aman to come in and take care of the laptop charging, so he will be there in 1 minute. Sir, first of all, thank you so much for detailing this session out. And we have around a couple of questions. I'll start with the first one. This question was raised in the starting of the session, even before you started the session. So I'm assuming this has already been dealt, but just to probably we would like to revisit it. The question is from CJM Sir, Gurdaspur. What is the difference between the amended section and the earlier section 20 of Specific Relief Act in terms of hardship?
All right. Now earlier under section 20, we had few equitable principles. One of the principle was the principle of hardship, that the specific performance of a contract would involve hardship, then that party would be relieved and the alternate relief would be granted. Now, since the entire part relating to specific performance of a contract has been restructured and specific performance of a contract has been given as an independent right, not based upon the discretion of the code as such, except in the few situations. Therefore, they removed all these equitable principle from the ambit of section 20. Now, I would like to share with you all that the expert committee, on the recommendation of which this act has been amended, had categorically stated or recommended that all these equitable principles which are there in section 20 of the act should be put in section 14 of the act. So the recommendation was to merge section 14 and section 20 together in a single provision. But this was not adhered to. This recommendation was not accepted. Now the question before us is that whether even after the deletion of these equitable principle, while adjudicating suit based upon specific performance of contract, can the court still apply these principles? The answer to my mind is yes, that these equitable principle may still be applicable, because the remedy of specific performance is inherently an equitable remedy. That is one. The modification by amending section 10 and certain other section is only to curb or regulate the discretion of the court. So therefore, if the specific performance of a contract in a given situation could lead to inequitable results, then the relief may be refused and the alternate relief of damages may be granted. But while undertaking the we can say the application of the doctrine of undue hardship, the other provisions of the act should also be kept in mind.
So moving to the next question, this is considering, we have to keep in mind this question is considering the current pandemic going on. The question is about would the doctrine of force majeure and doctrine of frustration apply in the case of non-performance of the contracts, considering the ongoing pandemic, and if the clauses are not special, even if the clauses are not specifically mentioned in the contract.
Now, so far as the application of force majeure clauses or the principle, it can definitely be made applicable during the current situation to the category of contracts where the fundamental purpose of the contract would stand, we can say, removed or would stand displaced. Let us suppose A had booked a marriage palace for the marriage on a particular date. Now, because of the pandemic, the holding of any function in the marriage has been made illegal by the government. So in all these cases, force majeure clause can be made applicable. That is one. But where the purpose would not be defeated and there would be only a delay in the performance of the contract, like in routine supply of certain articles or things which can be supplied even after the pandemic is over, there this clause would not be applicable. So therefore, subject to the parameters of force majeure clause, it can be made applicable in the current situation also.
So certainly. So next question is, if the definition of infrastructure projects is to be notified, whether any such notification has been issued by a union or a state government.
A central government has already notified, it is in the BEAR Act. They have identified the projects. So it is the central government which will notify. It is written in the provision itself.
Okay, sir. So moving ahead, this is pertaining to the new Rent Act of 1985 Punjab. It says, as per Section 4 of the said Act, rent agreement has to be in writing and registered. So if the rent agreement is not in writing or it is not registered, then the landlord cannot evict the tenant from the premises under the new Rent Act, Section 49. Then how a landlord can claim back possession of his premises from tenant?
Okay. Now, if under this unwritten contract or unregistered contract, the landlord has parted with the possession, yes, and the possession of the property is with the tenant, then the only disability which the landlord would entertain is, or the tenant would entertain is, that they would not be able to avail the remedies of the special law. But the remedies of the general law under Section 5 and 6, which you have studied, Section 9 CPC, all those remain intact and he can still claim back the possession.
So I think because that was this question was by Neeraj Goyal sir from Khanna district, and he had actually said the same thing in his second part. It's he was asking about Section 5 of Special Relief Act, and Section 9 of CPC can be, suit can be filed. So I think that's the same answer that you have given, sir. Moving to the next question, sir. I think this was a question by a lot of other members as well. So I think that has been answered automatically, which reduces the number of questions now. Second question, sir. If suit under Section 6 is dismissed, can plaintiff file subsequent suit under Section 5?
Yes.
Whether he'll be operate as res judicata?
No. Section 6 is a summary remedy. Mm-hmm. The adjudication rendered in Section 6 on the question of title never operates as adjudicata. The party who has lost a suit under Section 6 can approach the court by filing a regular suit under Section 5 and claim the possession, which may be either based upon possessory title, it may be based upon prescriptive title, it may be based upon legal title or ownership.
So now talking about adverse possession, the question is that is it not so that the adverse possession can only be used as a shield and not as a sword?
Now, after the judgment of the Apex Court in Ravinder Kaur Garewal, this earlier principle is no longer applicable. I may share with the participant that even prior to Ravinder Kaur Garewal judgment, there was one Privy Council judgment on the same very point, which said that a person in adverse possession, after he has perfected his prescriptive title, can file a suit for declaration and permanent injunction. So the same principle has been upheld now by the Honorable Apex Court in Ravinder Kaur Garewal judgment. So now, therefore, there is no controversy. That's why I have added one suit based upon prescriptive title under the ambit of Section 5 of the Act.
Now, so this question is about the tenancy, but in respect to the owner has died, and the owner was an NRI. He was residing in Canada, and after a couple of years, he's got to know that his father had a land in Punjab, but now that property is under his father's friend. So what are the options that NRI's son can avail to get that property back?
He can file a suit, regular suit under Section 5 of this Act. I've already stated that the general principle is that whosoever is the legal owner of the property possession will follow the ownership. There is no time limit as such for the legal owner to claim back his possession. He may file a suit after 90 years, 100 years, 200 years, whatever may be the time period. It is for the other party to establish the starting time of adverse possession, the terminating time of adverse possession, and only if he succeed in his defense, then only his suit would be defeated. So therefore he can file a suit under section 5 and claim back the possession. There is no hitch in that.
Even irrespective he's an NRI or a citizen of India.
I don't know why this confusion is there in the mind of our judicial officer. A person who is the owner may be the citizen of any country in the world. How does that make difference? So the citizenship has got nothing to do with the ownership rights.
So moving to the next question, sir. Suit of plaintiff under Section 6 of Specific Relief Act decreed. What remedy is available to defendant against that decree, sir?
Section 6 remedy is only to file the revision, and revision is only on a very, very limited ground. The factual aspect can't be touched. There cannot be reappreciation of the evidence. So only in case of patent illegality, the court can interfere in the revision part, otherwise not.
Sir, I like the way that you're answering the question very concise and simple. I think that is bringing a lot of clarity over here. Moving to the next question, sir. The question is from Panipat ADJ, sir. Where the defendant denies contract, where defendant denies contract, is it still necessary to frame the issue of readiness and willingness, or should we just ignore it?
Now, where the formation of the contract is being denied by the defendant, but the plaintiff is claiming the formation of a valid contract and it's breached by the defendant, in that eventuality also the readiness and willingness of the performance of his part of the contract by the plaintiff is required to be proved. So defendant may deny, may not deny the formation of the contract. The defendant may take any other defense or may impeach the validity of the contract. It is the plaintiff who is coming forth to seek the relief of the court. He is required to, because earlier it was averment, now he is required to prove his readiness and willingness to perform his part of the contract from the date of formation of the contract till the decree is passed.
Moving to we just have 2 more questions, sir. This question is from Batala, Harsimrandeep Kaur. First of all, she's conveying her regards to you. And the question is, infrastructure projects as a statutory provision now specifically provides that injunction can be granted subject to satisfaction that it will not delay the infrastructure projects. So the project has to be completed during the stipulated time that they have said that it will be completed. Has it not excessively curtailed the power of civil courts? Also, what are the safeguards which can be observed to ensure that the bona fide injunction matters are dealt with and appropriate relief is given to the parties?
Yes. The whole idea of making amendment was to curtail the discretion of the court in the reliefs provided in the Act. That is one. Secondly, while granting injunction, the courts are required to adjust or balance the equities between both the parties, it being an equitable relief. Now, in infrastructural projects, since their delay would cause loss to the public and to the economy, therefore, this fetter has been imposed by the Act upon the power of the court that if the grant of injunction would delay or impede it, then it should not be granted. But suppose you grant an interim injunction of 30 days just to have the reply of the public authority, this can be granted because it's a short interim injunction. But suppose you grant the injunction and keep it pending for years, that probably would be causing a lot of loss to the public exchequer, as well as impede the finalization of the project, which involves many factors. So therefore, while adjusting equities, these additional grounds which are now there under the Act are also to be kept in mind while dealing with such cases.
So the question is now whether government can claim adverse possession. This question is actually personal to me as well, because I'm also interested in the answer of this question. The question is whether government can claim adverse possession of a property in case of plaintiff files a suit for a possession of a property on which road was constructed with the consent of the plaintiff earlier. Can the court direct the authorities to acquire the land under relevant law? What are the remedies for this?
Now, so far as the public authority or state is concerned, this general doctrine of adverse possession, as such, to my mind, would not be applicable, because a state cannot be allowed to encroach upon the property of a citizen or its subject, as that would be the violation of Article 300 of the Constitution of India. So that is the first part. The second is, if the state has encroached upon the same or like constructed a road upon the same, then definitely the state can acquire the land and give, you can say, compensation to the person whose property it was.
So this brings us to the end of the question and answer round, sir. So I believe the detailing was such that I think that a lot of questions were repeated. So I have omitted those because we had already answered those questions. But I think that's all about it for today's session. So I would thank you, sir, for giving your time and answering all the questions and being so precise and with your answers, because that really helps the participants. And I'm sure the members who had joined in today got all their answers. So on behalf of Chennai Judicial Academy, on behalf of SCC Online, I would like to thank Baljinder Singh Sara sir for giving his time. I'd like to also thank all the judicial officers, lordships, ladyships who have attended this session across from Punjab, Haryana State Judiciary. I hope the session was fruitful. We'll be joining in tomorrow again for the second part, like Sara sir said in the starting. Dr. Gopal Arora sir will be taking this session tomorrow, the same time, 11:30, and he'll be talking on section 25 onwards on the same act. At the end, once again, Sara sir, thank you so much for your time and guidance. And now we will end the session, sir.
Thank you, Chetan. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Take care. Good night. Good day, guys. Everyone. Bye.